So solving or finding roots of quadratics using completing the square. So in order to do this, you're going to be given a trinomial that looks something like this. X squared minus 8x plus 15. And then you're going to end up being given something like this. First thing you need to do, since it says solve by completing the square, is you're going to write it in vertex form or complete the square. So if I had the equation x squared minus 8x plus 15. Now remember, when you're finding the roots, what does it have to be equal to? Like if you're on your graphing calculator, what does it need to be equal to find the roots? It's when x equals what? 0, because it hasn't gone up or down any. Remember, roots or zeros, that's the whole point, is you're finding when it's equal to 0. So your equations are going to usually be set up saying x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0. We just did the entry task where it is written as, or into vertex form. That is the same exact problem as the entry task. So when you're solving these, once written in vertex form, man, I can't spell today. Once written in vertex form, the first thing you need to do, or the first step, get the term with x. Oh man. Alone. So you're going to get this part alone. This is the term with x. You need to leave all of that by itself. So what's the opposite of subtract 1? Add 1. So you're going to add 1 to both sides. Then you're left with the parentheses x minus 4 squared equals 1. Now, remember, when we're trying to find out what x equals, or when we're trying to solve an equation, you always have to get x by itself. Now, remember, whenever we had like a 2 out here, we always just divided by the 2, because the opposite of multiply is divide. Does anybody know what the opposite of squaring something is? Square root. Perfect. So I'm going to take the square root of this. Now remember why, and I'm just going to do a little side note over here. If I have 2 squared, what is 2 squared? And if you're writing this down, put it over on the side, put it somewhere else. It does not really go with this. I'm just showing you why I took the square root. So what is 2 squared? 4, because 2 times 2 is 4. Now, if I take the square root of 4, on your calculator, I want you to click, or just watch for a second, take the square root of 4. What is the square root of 4? 2. Isn't that just this number right here? Isn't that just this number? Because if you're squaring something, that means take the number and multiply it by itself. When you take the square root of a number, it's saying take what two things or what multiplied by itself to get that number. 2 multiplies by itself to get 4. So when you take the square root of this, what ends up happening is the square root and the squared just cancel out and you're left with 2. So when you take the square root of both sides, the square root and the squared cancel, so all you're left with is x minus 4. Now, that is a little weird, so make sure, for those of you that are watching the video of it, that you ask if that does not make sense. So the opposite of squaring something is taking the square root, so you're left with just what you, in the beginning, what was in the parentheses. And then you have the square root of 1. So step 2, you take the square root of both sides. All right, so now, once you have that, now you're going to take the square root of 1. Now, the square root of 1, what number times itself gives you 1? 1 times 1 gives you 1, so the square root of 1 should be 1. But there's one more. You also have negative 1 times negative 1 equals 1. Do you agree a negative times a negative gives you a positive 1? Now, your calculator, if you type in the square root of 1, it is only going to give you the positive number. You have to remember, and this is the weirdest thing about quadratics, you have to remember it can either be a positive 1 or it could have been a negative 1, because a negative 1 times a negative 1 also gives you 1. So, remember, when you have a quadratic and you're finding the roots, you always have 2 possibilities because it makes that U shape. You have a parabola that makes a U shape that has 1, 2 zeros, or 2 roots. So that's where we are going to get the 2 of them. So step 3. Make sure to put a plus and a negative, since both negative 1 times negative 1 equals 1 and positive 1 times positive 1 equals 1. And watch how you write this. So you're going to write x minus 4 equals positive or positive and negative 1. So that's weird if you've never seen it before. So you have to put plus or minus is usually how it's read, plus or minus, but it ends up being both. You're going to solve it using a plus and you're going to solve it using a minus 1. Okay, and then the last step is set up the 2 equations and solve. So you're going to write it as x minus 4 equals a positive 1 and x minus 4 equals a negative 1. Okay, so now I'm going to solve both of them. So I want to solve for this x. So what's the opposite of subtract 4? Add 4. And I'm going to add 4 to a positive 1. So what is 1 plus 4? 5. So it would be x equals 5. And then I'm going to solve this one. What's the opposite of subtract 4? Add 4. And add 4 again. So it would be x equals, what is negative 1 plus 4? positive 3. So your two solutions are x equals 5 and x equals 3, or your two roots or zeros. Remember, that's one of those things in math, they call it all sorts of things. Sometimes they call it roots, sometimes they call it zeros, sometimes they just say find the solutions. So I'm going to type this in. I'm going to type in the original equation. So I have x squared minus 8x plus 15. I'm going to go ahead and hit graph. Remember, this is where you find the zeros, where you do second, trace, go to 2. I need to be to the left of it, or sorry, to the right of it. Oh no, to the left, and then to the right. Enter. So there's our first one, 3. Can you visually see where the other one is? It's 4, 5. Let me zoom in real quick. Do you agree the second 0 is at 5? The first one's at 3, the second one is at 5. Yes? Does everybody see that? So that's where mathematically, that is how you can find the zeros. Now, there are other ways to do it. We are just not going to have enough time this year to solve using the other ways. Like we're not going to be able to do the quadratic formula. We're not going to have time to, yeah, that's pretty much the only other one we have. So let's do one more example, and then you can get to your assignment for today. So if we have x squared plus 10x plus 21 equals 0. Now, you have to first complete the square. So how am I going to complete the square on this problem? You can either use the algebra tiles or use the formula. What times what gives you x squared? X. What two things combine to give you 10x, or what is 10x cut in half? 5, so it would be plus 5. Now, how do I figure out, if you're doing algebra tiles, how many algebra tiles would you need? How many algebra tiles would you need? So you have 5 and 5. What's 5 times 5? 25. So you would need 25. How many do we have, though? 21. So it would be 4 short. Or you could do 21 minus 25 is negative 4. Whichever way you prefer to do it. Make sure you always have to write the equals 0 part, because you have to have the equation piece of it, because we're trying to find the zeros. So if it just gave you an equation, y equals x squared plus 10x plus 21, if you're trying to solve it, you always need to set it equal to 0, because remember, the zeros are when it's equal to 0. Okay, now look back at your steps that you just wrote down. What's the first step you need to do? Get the term with x alone. So I need to get this right here by itself. So what's the opposite of subtract 4? Add 4. That cancels. Add 4 to the other side. So then I have x plus 5 squared equals 4. What's the opposite of squaring this parentheses right here? The square root. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. The square root and the squared cancel. So I'm left with just x. Oh, I don't need the parentheses. Just x plus 5 equals the square root of 4. Okay, what is the square root of 4? It's 2. What is the one thing that's different about this than you normally would think. You always have to put plus and minus 2. So when you type in the square root of 4, second, the x squared button 4, it's going to give you 2. You just have to remember a negative 2 times a negative 2 would have also given you a 4. Okay, now write your equation once with a positive 2, once with a negative 2. So it'd be x plus 5 equals positive 2, and x plus 5 equals negative 2. And then solve them. What's the opposite of add 5? Subtract 5. Oh, I just wrote 2. So subtract 5, subtract 5. So x would equal, what is 2 minus 5? Negative 3. And then solve the second equation. Subtract 5, subtract 5. What's negative 2 minus 5? Negative 7. So those are your two solutions. Now, the reason I have put this assignment on Schoology is I need you to know immediately if you're getting them right or wrong. We still haven't decided if we're going to do the activity Friday and then the test Monday or test Monday, activity Friday. You will turn in the paper. I will not give you a grade unless I see this work for every single problem. Because yes, you know how to find the zeros using your graphing calculator. But if I do not see this work, I am not going to give you the grade. Also with that, if I don't see work turned in, I'm just going to not let you guys be able to know if you're getting them right or wrong instantly by using Schoology. That is the main reason I use Schoology, is so that you know immediately and you're not waiting for me to grade your worksheet for 2 weeks. All right. So go ahead and open the assignment on Schoology.